Okay, it's my total pleasure to be joined today on Bad Faith Podcast by Lisa Pease. Some of you reached out to me and recommended her actually as a guest on this show after I went on Twitter and asked the audience, who is so knowledgeable and good, about who would be an amazing historian to come on and talk about the history of presidential assassinations, obviously because of the recent attempt on former President Trump's life. And Lisa Pease was the number one recommended person. She is the author of A Lie Too Big to Fail, the real history of the RFK assassination, but also has been a historian of all kinds of political assassinations, I think principally in the 1960s. Lisa, welcome to Bad Faith Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I follow you on Twitter, and I'm so down with you on Palestine, and you go. So,
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. It's always a pleasure when someone recommends a guest and you discover your mutuals, and it makes our job as bookers and podcasters so much easier, that much easier. Okay,
Yes.
so I think a good place to start for people who, like myself, at least up until I was preparing for this podcast, weren't super aware of both the kind of official narrative around the RFK assassination and then your alternative version of events. Can you start by saying, what is the story on the books? Then we'll talk about what you discovered through all of your research. And then we'll bring it full circle. And I'd love to get your perspective on what some people are pointing to as what seem to be some, at very least, inconsistencies around the Donald Trump assassination, with the caveat, obviously, that we still are waiting for information to
The
come in. We're still
developing
very much in the early days. Exactly. So what is the official narrative around the RFK assassination?
So the official narrative is that on the night of June 4th, Robert Kennedy won the California Democratic primary in Los Angeles, where I live. I've actually been to the Ambassador Hotel where he had his victory celebration. And after he gave his speech, he walked off stage and through a little kitchen pantry serving area en route to the print media, because at every stop he always made a point of talking to the print media, not just the TV media, because he was one time a reporter himself. As he enters the pantry, he's shaking hands with busboys, and all of a sudden, a young, dark, curly-haired man stands in front of him, pulls out a gun, fires. Kennedy throws up his hands and turns to his left and falls down shot. And so the people in the room say, "We see a shooter, we see the shootin'," so to speak. Sirhan, as they didn't know, by the way, what his name was, because like the Trump shooter, he had no ID on him at the time, and I'll come back to that later. But they found out later his name was Sirhan Bashara Sirhan. He's a Palestinian immigrant. His family was there during the Nakba, and it's a tragic story. But they came to America in hopes of a better life. But supposedly he was angry that Robert Kennedy, not Jr., had sent bombers to Israel. And that was supposedly his motive for shooting Kennedy. And there was a trial, and he was convicted and given the death sentence. And then California changed the law, and so he was not actually executed. And then they later reinstated the death sentence, but those people in that interim period did not get it. So he's still alive in the Richard Donovan facility down by San Diego. He was finally granted parole for the first time just a few years back, partly because Robert Kennedy Jr. and one of his brothers, Douglas, testified to the board virtually, because this was all during lockdown, and pled for his release, and it was granted. And then Gavin Newsom, who may be our next presidential candidate, was the one who actually vetoed Sirhan's parole. So
Interesting.
after a 2-week disappearance where the media was speculating, where is the governor? Does he have COVID and he's not telling us? And I'm thinking, did he run to Langley for instructions because Sirhan was given parole? Who knows?
Interesting. I mean, that's an
Yeah.
interesting theory because, part of what you get into in, your book and in various interviews you've done over the years is that Sirhan still maintains that he has no memory of that day. So it is interesting to think, what is the motive to kind of keep him away and shut up if, all of these decades later, he still doesn't seem to be able to recall what really did happen that day. Yeah.
And even with one of the best hypnotists in the country, Dan Brown, who has testified at numerous trials and taught and wrote 4 textbooks that are used in universities, he was given 60 hours with Sirhan over a 2-year period. And
Mm.
even he couldn't get him to remember shooting Kennedy. What he did remember, I'm thinking maybe I'm telling this out of order, but basically what Sirhan did remember is that he was with a girl in a polka dot dress. And he thought she was really sexy, and he poured her coffee, and they walked into the pantry. And then she kind of put him on the tray stand. There's a tray stand at the end of this big ice machine in the pantry. And it would you be like a foot off the ground there, so you'd be a little bit above the crowd. And then right as evidently as Kennedy was coming in, she moved him to the center of the room and then pinched him a certain way. And suddenly he thought he was back at a shooting range, a target range. And he pulled out his gun and he fired in his mind's eye at targets. And next thing you know, he's being choked. And he almost comes out of what appears strongly to be a hypnotic state. Like, why am I choking? Why is there a gun in my hand? Why are people lying on the floor? Did I shoot somebody? And then he's kind of back in the hypnosis again. It wasn't quite enough, life threatening. He almost came to awareness, but didn't. But that's the most he's ever been able to remember it. And that was under open-ended hypnosis because his defense team had also hypnotized him before the trial, trying to find the motive. Here's the kind of thing they're like, they said, it's like, Sirhan, there's Robert Kennedy. He's coming in. Reach for your gun, Sirhan. All right, pull your gun and fire at him. Do you remember that? This is what they were trying to do to him under hypnosis. And with some people, that might have stuck. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So help me understand, because people might be thinking, all right, he has no memory of anything. So where does this motive come from? Can you talk about the note that was found in his pocket?
Yes. So when he was arrested, obviously, there was a note about, I forget the man's name now, but it had to do with the arms deal in support of Israel. And his lawyers basically had to give him that as a motive. And Sirhan said at one point, he's like, I don't know why I would have killed him, but I'd rather say I killed him for Israel than go down in history as a crazy person who can't remember,
Mm.
And so that
Mm.
was like a conscious choice because he was Palestinian and that did upset him. But when they asked him, during the trial, what did you think the first time you saw Kennedy? And he's like, I thought he was a saint. It's like, so he was not this angry Palestinian character he was portrayed to be, but he may have been programmed to be the angry Palestinian character.
So before we get a little bit more into the hypnosis stuff, I do want to just
Yes.
stick with the stuff at the scene, because I do think for me, I wrestle with, I want to be honest with you, I'm very open to what seem to be some pretty significant inconsistencies what happened on the scene. I also find compelling the fact that uh, Bobby Kennedy's own children do not believe that he did it.
Well, Bobby, I want to just interject. Oh, go ahead. I just want to interject there because I did get to know Robert Kennedy Jr. pretty well. At one point, I kind of had to disavow him for his support of Israel in this
Mm,
horrific war. But before
mm,
that, he shared some stuff with the family. And he's like, Lisa, none of them have ever looked into the case. And it's like the one book that they did read came out in 1968, just months after the assassination, before any files were released. And it's just really painful and traumatic for them. Plus, Ethel was in the pantry. And so, in her mind, if there were other shooters, I would have seen them, is her thought. But of course, if
mm.
the guns were concealed, if it was in a purse or under a coat jacket or in a camera, there are many ways to hide guns. And if you don't believe me, go to the CI Museum in DC and look at all the ways that they hide guns, cigarette cases. I mean, it's just amazing what they can do, even in the palm of your hand, where you could pull a ring on your finger and fire a 22 bullet without anybody seeing that you even have a gun. So there are numerous ways. But anyway, so that's why the family it's like I said, and they were all young. And I think there's something I would call it, I'm not a psychologist, but if I were, I would call it trauma imprinting. When you learn
Mm,
something and you're young and it's in trauma that you learn it, you
mm.
can't, it's very hard to break free of that. That
Yes, and I can
becomes your reality.
appreciate why you would sort of not want to dig up all of the feelings and emotionality around reliving that. So I certainly understand how that can be the case. But the reason why you're raising this question, this issue of all the other ways that guns could be on the scene and not be so easily identified, is because I think perhaps the most persuasive bit of evidence that undermines the official narrative of RFK's assassination is the discrepancy between the number of bullets that Sirhan's gun could hold, the number of bullet entry points into individuals, including RFK, but also others, and bullet entry points that were found in the door frame and other places in the room that just don't line up. So can you walk us through what that kind of evidentiary discrepancy is?
Yes. So, as you mentioned, they're literally in the official story, even before we get to the actual evidence, but in the official story, there are 12 bullet points of entry because some people were shot twice. Robert Kennedy was shot 4 times. Only 3 of the bullets entered or touched in any way his body. One passed straight through his coat lining and didn't quite enter his body. They suspect that one, because it was a steep upward angle from behind. And by the way, all the witnesses who saw them both during the time of the shooting and could definitely identify Siran as the shooter had them facing each other and about 3 feet apart. And yet the autopsy report shows Kennedy was hit from right behind the right ear. So there's no physical
With
way
the
Sirhan could
fatal
have
bullet.
shot. Yeah, the fatal bullets. Because again, remember, 4 of them went through him. So 4 of them had to be fired by somebody else. And the other bullets, there were 3 holes in the ceiling tiles. 5 other people had bullets removed from them. 2 bullets were lodged in Kennedy. And with the 3 bullet holes in the ceiling, the police decided, well, one went up, ricocheted back down, hit the floor, and then entered some other victim in the head. And, and then the third, the last bullet just stayed in the ceiling and was lost in the ceiling space. So that's the official story. That's before you get to the bullet holes in the door frames, because there were, and the FBI photographed them. And while I was working on my book, I actually found film not only of the bullet holes, because people have tried to say, oh, the waiters were just poking pencils in the wall and that's what those holes are. Like, first of all, this is the Ambassador Hotel. It's like, that was kind of a nice, ritzy hotel. Presidents
Mm.
stayed there. Eisenhower stayed there. Barbara Streisand got her start there. You wouldn't hire the kind of people who would stand around and poke pencils in the wall, even in the kitchen area. So that's just baloney. But in the video I saw, it shows the paneling. You know, if you look at any door frame in your house or, somebody's house, there's like a wood frame around the door. That wood
Sure.
paneling had been pulled off. And in the video, it shows 2 holes in the paneling and 2 matching holes in the door frame. So something had to penetrate 3/4 of an inch of wood to get back there. A pencil can't do that. That's
And
thick
was there
pine
any
wood. Yeah.
explanation for why, in the middle of a murder investigation, suddenly the paneling of a door in the pantry at the scene would have gone missing?
Well, there is an explanation. I just don't buy it. They're like, well, it didn't fit in the evidence room, so we burned them.
So they acknowledged that they took the paneling as evidence.
Yes. Yes. And then they said they had no evidentiary. Well, they said they had no evidentiary value, so we burned them, which is simply not true. And in fact,
So
there
then
was
why
a
did you take them in the first place?
Right, exactly. And
Okay.
it's worse than that because the sheriffs were next door. It was literally the first time we used electronic vote counting in this country. And it was happening, basically at the next property over. There was an IBM building and the sheriffs were there. So when the call about the assassination went out, they ran over first and they took bullets out of the wall. And we know that because they literally circled them and put their initials there. Those bullets are all
Hmm.
gone. It's like, where did they go? And of
Uh,
course, in my book, I talk about how the chief suspect, who I believe planned the assassination, was also very good friends with the LA sheriff, Peter Pitchess, at that point in time. So, how convenient would that be?
okay, so I want to definitely come back to that and what you think basically the
Mhm.
true story is. But one other kind of evidentiary hook I want to talk about just to lay the foundation so people, I think, understand where skepticism around the official narrative is from, is to also talk about the relationship between the bullets that were recovered and the alleged shooter's gun and the failure of them to match up. So one, we have the numerical discrepancy, number of bullets versus, so how many bullets were fired in the official story?
So 8 bullets, because that's all that Sirhan's gun could hold, and there was no way he had time to reload. He had a little 22
Well, I thought even in
caliber.
the official story, there was a larger number of bullet holes that were sort of unaccounted for.
They made them do double duty. So, for example, one witness had a hole in his pants leg, but he was also hit in the upper thigh. So the bullet that went through the hole in the pants leg had to end up in one of the other victims in their scenario. None of the
I see.
trajectories work or match, but they took the 12 points of entry and squished it into an 8 bullet
Into 8 bullets.
scenario.
Okay, so then the next kind of layer of obfuscation is whether or not the bullets that were collected actually match the make of gun that was allegedly used. So can you walk us through that?
Right. So it was in the early 1970s. Ted Chirac found out that one of the evidence envelopes had a different gun number on it. And Bill Harper, who was a local criminalist in Pasadena, not in Los Angeles, and who knew people in the LAPD. In fact, he'd been in the OSS, had a lot of people in the LAPD, the OSS being the forerunner to the CIA. So he had informants inside who said they switched the gun, they switched the bullets. And so Harper wanted to figure this out, and he went and looked at the evidence. And what he found was two different kinds of bullets that didn't match each other. So he went to the media with this. And what it looks like is the LAPD had anticipated that and literally dummied up bullets in advance. Literally, I mean, the primary was June 4th. Kennedy was shot right after midnight, like 12:15 a.m. on June 5th. And then June 6th, he died at about 1:30 something a.m. Okay. So later on June 6th, for the first time, the police get a Kennedy bullet, a bullet from Kennedy's body. The criminalist, Dwayne Wolford, did not even do a physical comparison between that and one of the Sirhan test bullets. And I suspect the reason for that is he recognized right away they didn't match. What would be the
Hmm.
point? You don't want a photo of that mismatch. You don't want that in the record at all. So he didn't do that. And he goes away for 5 hours in his log. He's logging his activities. There's a gap between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. that night. And then he comes back into the lab. Well, that night, a photo comparison of two bullets was made. Now, the Kennedy neck bullet, because the ear bullet shattered in the head, so they couldn't retrieve that. But there was one that lodged at the base of Kennedy's neck that was fairly intact. You could use it for bullet comparisons. So they pulled that out. The coroner is the one who gave it to the police, and the coroner, Thomas Noguchi, wrote TN 31 on this little 22 on the base of the bullet. He said, "This is how I always mark my bullets. I use my initials and the last two digits of the autopsy case number." So we know, and he confirmed that at the grand jury. He said, "Yep, that's the bullet, TN31." All right. In this photo that was taken on June 6th, bullets were re-examined in 1975 because by then a lot of conspiracy had come up. There was a film, The Second Gun, that brought forward a lot of the anomalies with the ballistics evidence. And so Paul Schrade, one of the pantry victims, joined with CBS to sue LA County to try and get some sort of an evidentiary hearing. And they agreed to just examine the bullets to prove that they were legit. This was the whole goal of this, and to find out if there was one gun or two used, because there was another expert besides Harper who also looked at the bullets and said, this set of bullets from these victims has one cannular, and this set, from Kennedy has two cannulars. They can't have come from the same gun.
And what's a cannelure for those of us who aren't as steeped in the ballistics?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like a little ring. I don't know how to describe it on the bullet. There are like grooves on the bullet, striation marks as it comes out, um,
Hmm.
grooves and canyons, but the cannular is like a little ring at the base of the bullet. And every manufacturer does them slightly differently. So it's pretty
Mm,
easy to tell if the bullets have different markings on them.
I see.
Um, So there was a question. And so in 1975, Judge Wenke in Los Angeles ordered kind of a retesting of the evidence just to see, have a bunch of ballistic experts who, by the way, Wolfer picked all but one of them. There were like 8 experts, and 7 of them were picked by Dwayne Wolfer himself from associates he had made. Actually, right after the assassination, he started an association of firearms identification. So he was able to teach everybody the way he wanted and look like an expert, brings in all his friends, and then one independent guy that Paul Schrade had chosen. And they all look at the evidence and they go, well, there's no issue with the cannelures. We see they all have the same number. So we can say only one gun was used. They all seem to match each other. But what they didn't say, or what the media didn't report, because they did say it, but the media didn't really report it, is that, but none of them matched Sirhan's gun. And what they didn't even know at the time, because they didn't check it, it was years later that a woman in Pasadena, and she's kind of a crazy, interesting character. She was like a collector of oddities, but she was a neighbor of Sirhan's. And so she didn't believe he had done it. And she was also a friend of Bill Harper's. And when he told her they switched the gun, they switched the bullets, she started looking into ballistics evidence. And she found, and I was able to confirm, again, when Thomas Noguchi got the Kennedy neck bullet, it was TN31 on the base. But when the panel looked at it, it said DWTN on the base. Dwayne Wolfer, Thomas Noguchi. It was clear that he just dummied it up. He didn't even bother to check what was on the original thing to try and match it exactly, because who looks at the base of bullets? Most people, on the outside of the police don't even know they mark bullets. They don't even think about that. It never come up in a court case. So actually, in Wolfer's case, it had. He had provably forged bullets in another case. And he even mentioned that in the context of this case. But
Wait, why did he mention that he had previously forged bullets in another
that's a
case?
long story. I don't want to
Okay.
derail this because it's really a side story, but it's in my book. If people want to know, he was basically almost sued for something else and did admit that he had changed the bullets in one, but it was kind of like it was, just to get it through the court faster because we all knew he was guilty anyway, sort of thing. So, but it wasn't only that bullet that was switched. Anyway, there was another bullet that was switched. And what's interesting is in the LAPD's own files, they said, we have this photo micrograph comparison of bullets that we can bring out if this case is ever retried. But we shouldn't release it too early because a discerning buff might understand there's a problem with that evidence. So it's like,
wait, so who's saying that they kind of understand
in
that
the
there's
LAPD, yeah, the LAPD,
I see.
it's an unsigned memo, but it's one of theirs, and it was a confidential addendum to the Lowenstein inquiry, because Allard Lowenstein, a congressman who was a friend of Robert Kennedy's, got interested in the case when he had talked to people who'd been in the pantry, and they said they were facing each other. And then he read the autopsy report, and he's like, oh my God, the earth shifted, because if the shooter was behind, it couldn't have been Sirhan. And we've been told this entirely false story. So he started digging in. And this was a confidential addendum to the Lowenstein inquiry, which the police probably forgot they had. I think if they'd realized that kind of an incriminating letter was in their files, they would have destroyed it. But here's the other thing. They didn't release their files until 1988, 20 years later. And so none of this was
I'm so glad you're bringing that up, because this is what I want to move to next, which is how you know all of this. And I think the story
Yes.
of how you became interested in this and how you came to be an authority, because you were kind of early to access what at the time was relatively newly available information, and also new to the internet itself as a kind of a way to connect with other people and to share these kinds of theories on the internet. All of that seemed to have created a kind of a perfect storm for you to be in a position to be an expert on this and to write your book. So how can you explain to the audience how you first got into this?
Yeah, my very first internet search ever, and this was before browsers. This was when we only had like news groups, Alt Conspiracy JFK and this and that, and Pine news readers. I mean, email wasn't a thing then, and Gopher, FTP sites. You probably mean nothing to you because you're too young, but anybody old
No, my
enough.
mother always talks about Gopher searches. Oh, you guys have it so easy when I was in grad school, yada, yada.
Yeah, before Google, there was this thing called Gopher that searched the internet. And my very first search ever just happened to be JFK assassination. And it came because I had just come off the Jerry Brown campaign. I was literally his, kind of executive assistant at the end of the campaign, working directly with Jody Evans, who now is part of Code Pink, but was then running Jerry Brown's 1992, grassroots campaign. So
Huh.
I saw how bad the media was in terms of, like, I'd go to an event, there'd be 3,000 people. Now, you've been in politics. 3,000 people at a political event is actually a big deal, right? Now, not counting Bernie, where you get like 60,000, right? God bless him. But anyway, I would see how the media would say, "Oh, a handful of Bernie supporters." I'm like, a handful is
Mm-hmm.
what Biden gets. There's like 100 people in
Mm-hmm.
a room. That when Sherry Brown was pulling down like 3,000 before the internet, right? And so I thought, if they were that wrong about that, what else might they be wrong about? And I had a short stint with Fairness and Accuracy Reporting, where I learned to read the media much more critically and to pay attention to bylines. In fact, when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, I knew who was going to write the story in the LA Times, and I knew what the spin would be, because Jennifer Harbury had been in the media about her husband being killed by the CIA in South America. And this had been taking all the air out of the airwaves, and the CI was under increased scrutiny. And so, sure enough,
Mm-hmm.
Robin Wright of the LA Times wrote the story saying, now we need the CIA more than ever.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I didn't predict is she'd have two co-writers, but it's, if you get to know the media, you see these things coming. So anyway, so all of that prepared me well. When at a garage sale, I picked up a couple of books, on the JFK case and one on the RFK case, read them. It felt like mythology to me at the time, because I didn't know any of that history and I didn't have any way to check it. But like I said, the internet was coming public. I searched it, and I ended up in a news group where the JFK case was hotly debated, and I'd read two books, so I thought I was an expert. Ha ha ha. There are people who had been studying it, for like 20 years prior to me, who were willing to shoot me down and take me on any little point. So I ultimately ended up getting my own set of the Warren Commission volumes, and being a super careful researcher, because who likes to be attacked like that, right? I wanted to be able to hold my ground. And one day at the LA library, because I used to work here there, and I would go read books or magazine articles, or Warren Commission or whatever I could find. And one day I pulled out the wrong drawer. I was looking for the FBI files on the JFK case, but I found the LAPD files on the RFK case. And this was 1992. So I'm like, those files have only been out for like 4 years. I had no idea they were available on microfilm. I bet I'll find something in them that no one else has found. And so I've been reading them ever since. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously there was a lot in there. And literally the first reel that I put in talked about a second man apprehended at the hotel that night, who was not Sirhan. His name was Michael Wayne. Totally different character, fascinating Nazi type who knew the inside of the RFK campaign headquarters very well in a kind of scarily detailed way, and seemed to be the on-site manager of the plot, is the way I read his participation. He was begging press passes of people all night, because a press pass at a political event is like an all-access pass at a rock concert. It gets you
Mm-hmm.
anywhere. There's no room that's closed to you if you're part of the press. And so he seemed to have collected them and handed them out to his associates. And
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that's how I got into it. And I was at the time working with Jim DiEugenio, who wrote Destiny Betrayed, and who was the man behind Oliver Stone's recent documentary on JFK, two documentaries. Excuse me. And Jim and I wrote a little magazine called Probe Magazine, and the ARB, the Assassination Archives Research Board, had been created by Congress to try to free the files in the wake of Stone's fictional film JFK. And so it was a good time to be researching that, because there was stuff in the news and there were new files coming out all the time. And I just have a knack for seeing like the parallels between the present and the past. And so I loved what our articles, because we could always talk about some current event and relate it back to one of these assassinations that happened in the 60s, or the characters, or the trajectory that was started. I mean, look at Iran and what a mess we made of it. They had a secular government, a democracy. We overthrew it and put in a fascist right-wing dictator. And then they had a rebellion to that, and now, turned fundamentalist on us. And after we had funded a lot of the fundamentalists, what do I want to say, fundamentalist Muslims abroad as a reason, so they would resist Russian communism. So it's like we're now kind of all our chickens are coming home to roost, as Malcolm X said. Yeah.
Right. And then later Reverend Wright, much to the consternation of Barack Obama. I mean, so this is interesting. So obviously the reason why I right now wanted to have you on is because it does seem premature to be jumping to certain kinds of conclusions about what may or may not have happened in terms of security lapses that allowed Donald Trump to be shot and come very close to being killed. Experts weighing in seem in the the Secret Service seems to be acknowledging as well that a roof with at the proximity, a rooftop close as it was to where President Trump was giving his speech ordinarily would have had coverage by Secret Service. And the explanation that Secret Service has given as to why that wasn't the case, that the roof was too sloped and presented a danger for an agent to be on top, is belied by the presence of agents at similarly sloped or more acutely
On a
sloped
more
roofs
sloped roof,
nearby.
right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, again, this will continue to play out, but it does appear to be the case, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there were snipers that had the shooter in their sights and declined to shoot until after the assassin shot at Donald Trump, which raises some questions that are pretty
A lot of
self-evident.
questions.
Right.
Mhm.
So when you're talking about drawing comparisons between these historical assassinations and the present, I think you were alluding not just to like a present presidential assassination, because that hadn't happened until just now, but to what America does in terms of its kind of quote unquote democracy spreading agenda all over the world, and a cycle of the interference of America kind of through direct military action or through more covert CIA actions to basically choose the government, choose the politics, choose the economic systems, choose the leadership of people all over the world, feeding into this idea that there is something other than democracy, the will of an elected leader, the president themselves, that is controlling policy, and that there are these other kind of shadowy operators, call them the deep state, call them whatever you will, that are really running the country. And that when there is a disjuncture between a presidential candidate or president themselves and the direction that the people who are really in charge wanted to go, that's when we get these kind of domestic assassination attempts or real assassinations. And so I want to go back to, before we bring it into the present, go back to RFK and talk to what you think the motives would be, given that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I also want to say, because it's directly relevant and parallel, I believe, is that Sirhan was not actually firing bullets, because I didn't say that in the first part. But again, the fact that not one of the bullets could match his gun, and frankly, none of the trajectories match his position, because after the first two shots, which the first one would have been, if he had bullets, he would have hit Kennedy in the chest. I mean, he was right there in front of him with an open line of sight. So there's kind of no excuse if he had bullets for Kennedy not to have been hit in the chest. And I bring this up because if Sirhan's firing blanks, the purpose of that would be to distract from the actual shooters. Think of a magic act and the magician's assistant, and she's all beautiful and she gets into the box and you don't see what's happening because you're focused on a certain part of the act and you miss what's happening in another part of the act. Magic is all about distraction and misdirection. And so are the assassinations of the 60s and the plots. And so with Sirhan firing blanks and pulling focus, everybody sees his gun, they all freeze or drop to the floor or run out of the room, but they're focused. If they're still there, they're looking at Sirhan and they are not looking anywhere else. And in fact, Rayford Johnson said the same thing. Once I saw a gun, I didn't look anywhere else. I might have looked around, if I hadn't seen that gun, but since I did, why would I want to look anywhere else? And it doesn't occur to people that an assassination could be staged deliberately to pull focus to one place while the real shooter is somewhere else. And so
Can I ask
if we
you
bring
about that?
yes. Mm-hmm.
Uh, if Sirhan were firing blanks, and we haven't really gotten into this yet, so I apologize for skipping ahead a little bit, but if he in fact were under some kind of hypnosis or influence kind of meddling. Why not go ahead and put real bullets in his gun? Because he is in a position where he has proximity. He's right there. If you want Bobby
Because
Kennedy
he's only
dead,
going to get one or two shots and he's going to get captured. And you really want to kill the guy. I mean, if the CIA killed President Kennedy, as many of us who've researched it for many years believe, based on a huge amount of evidence, then you definitely don't want his brother, who's actually one of the best Senate investigators that ever was, who uncovered a lot of scandals and pursued them fearlessly, who went up against the mob and took them down. This is not the guy that you want in the presidency because he's going to expose your part in the plot. Okay. So, but why they would use blanks is because, like I said, if you have Sirhan has bullets, what if he hits the guy who's supposed to kill Kennedy first by
this is what I
mistake?
said. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I was, as you know, in the car. I was running late for this. I was stuck in traffic on the freeway heading back from Boston and Boston and then New York. And I was talking to the driver of the car as we were listening to one of your other podcasts, and he brought up this question, and I was like, I said exactly what you just said. Like, if you have a real agent in the mix, and obviously a lot of people are getting hit, there's strays. This guy's under hypnotism. He's not in his right mind. He may be under some influence of a
Yeah,
drug. You
he's
don't
not
want
an
him
experienced
shooting
assassin.
your guy. Yeah.
Right.
I think that does
Right.
make sense. But my follow-up question with that is there
Mhm.
a concern that if you put the gun holds 8 bullets, if you if he doesn't fire all 8, you can be in a situation where they collect the weapon and it has blanks in it, and then you are having to explain away the blanks. I mean, what do you make of that, like, as a strategic choice and
Yeah, I was going to say
vulnerability?
the gun was emptied. And he may have only had 3 or 4 or 5 bullets because people were hearing sounds and they were seeing him pull the trigger. But again, you can't prove they were actually coming out of Sirhan. But interestingly enough, there were 8 shells in the gun. And again, when I say blanks, I don't mean like for a cap gun blanks. They have slugless cartridges that act like blanks out of a
Mm.
regular gun. And so if those are expended, yeah, you don't want him captured. But on the other hand, it's going to the LAPD and they're already willing to fudge and
Mm.
change evidence and bullet, it's like they pretty much knew the cover up was guaranteed. But even so, when that 1975 panel was going to reinvestigate the case, there was court order one listed the shells as part of the investigation because you'd think they would be crimped or something to, keep the blank in place or whatever. There might have been some telltale signs on the shells that could have given away the plot. And so guess what? There's a court order two, which replaces court order one. The shells are no longer on that. So they didn't even look at the shells, which people have said are like thumbprints for a gun. It's so easy to match a shell to a specific gun. But the shells were removed, and if they switched the gun, there would be a good reason for them to do that. Yeah, so lots of reasons. Yeah,
Okay. So I've interrupted you now a bunch of times from getting
that's
into
all
what you
right.
think really happened. So I'm desperate to
Yeah.
hear, what do you think really happened that day?
Yeah, so obviously, to me, Sirhan was a mind-controlled patsy. He had obviously been programmed prior to Kennedy announcing for president, probably as a hypnotic courier, which was something the CIA was making heavy use of. You could program something into somebody's brain, send them to another country. Somebody else could decode the message at the other end, they could come back. Maybe he was being trained as an assassin, maybe not, but it wasn't a long period of time. And that's the other thing. I read in The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which is somewhere behind me, by Jonathan Marks, at the very end of his book, which is all about the CIA's attempt to make a mind-controlled assassin. He ends the book by saying, but why would you bother? Because it's so much easier to just hire an actual assassin who can kill and get away and who knows what they're doing. Why take a risk with the hypnosis? And he adds in a footnote that no one seems to have read, but a mind controlled patsy would make a huge amount of sense because you could set them up in advance and they wouldn't know they were being set up. You could layer in a motive without them being aware that that's what you were doing. And then you can pull the trigger on the story of their activity, at the appropriate moment. And they would have no memory of being programmed because that's what happens, if you're under deep hypnosis and you wouldn't take somebody who couldn't be deeply programmed, and Sirhan was of the most highly hypnotizable category. But that's the kind of person you would do this with, because they would have no memory that they were even programmed or set up. And as we both said at the top of this show, to this day, Sirhan literally cannot remember what happened in the pantry. And I wanted to talk about, there was one other shooter right beside Sirhan on the table, and I have several very credible witnesses, including a fire department photographer who happened to be in there and thought that was Sirhan, but it was not. It was a guy walking back and forth on the table who then fired down into the crowd because somebody had to look like they were shooting from that position. So it had to be a similar enough trajectory to Sirhan to make it plausible that he would have shot somebody.
So walk me through that. There's a witness. There's a witness in the
There's
room.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. And here's what the
Okay.
police did. So the problem is, again, each witness saw one shooter. There's only a couple witnesses who saw two shooters, and the police tried to make them disappear to the greatest extent in the record. But most people only saw one shooter. And when they described it, the police said, "Oh, that was Sirhan. You saw Sirhan." But it wasn't Sirhan. Like I said, a guy in a gold sweater, that was not Sirhan. Or they'd try and say, "Oh, that was Michael Wayne," or that was somebody else. And
So just so I understand, there's multiple witnesses in the room who said,
yeah,
I saw a shooter. I describe him as a dark-haired guy in a gold sweater. The police say, well, yeah, the dark-haired guy was Sirhan, but that does not match what Sirhan was wearing that day. It does match what, and we haven't gotten to this yet, but
right,
what one campaign worker in particular said she saw in terms of three individuals going into the party: a woman with a polka dot dress, a man with a gold top, and then a third guy who is believed to be Sirhan.
right. She's one of the only ones who saw multiple people together. At the moment of the shooting, most people saw either Sirhan or the gunman nearest them, and that's all they looked at, and that they all thought it was kind of the same guy. And here's the other thing: I do believe they employed lookalikes so that they were close enough that if you only saw them for a few seconds, as most people did, because once the shooting started, people dove to the floor or cupboard, or the very few kept their eyes open the whole time. So it's not like they see them later on TV and go, "Wait a minute, that's not the guy." They really don't remember. They remember the trauma of the incident, but not the details of the shooter, so to speak.
So walk me through, because what I find so compelling is your attention to detail to sort of the trial record, what is omitted, what seems to be an effort to make certain inconvenient witnesses go away. So who are the witnesses that did see multiple shooter, and in particular, a shooter that was not Sirhan? And walk us through kind of what they told the police and then what the police did with that information.
Well, we could start with Sandy Serrano. Now, she didn't see the shooters because she was sitting out back. She was a young Hispanic campaign worker who met Robert Kennedy, when he stepped on her toe in an elevator at a different event. And she had been to a lot of the events, so she was not in the room when he gave his speech. She's like, "I've heard it a billion times, and it was hot." And so she was sitting on the back fire escape, which for anybody in Los Angeles is the 8th Street side of the Ambassador Hotel, as opposed to the Wilshire side of the Ambassador Hotel. 7th Street would have run right through the property, except that it stopped at both ends. But so anyway, she's on the 8th Street side of the building. It's dark, and there's a hill that leads up to a parking lot. And as she's sitting there thinking how great this victory night is and sipping her little orange Harvey Wallbanger or whatever, um, three people come walking up, a girl in a white dress with dark polka dots, and she remembered it because a friend of hers had bought a dress very similar. So it stuck in her
Hmm.
mind. It's like, "Oh, that looks just like my friend's dress." And then a guy in a gold sweater, as we mentioned, who was medium height and Hispanic. They all, or two of them, look Hispanic. The girl did not. But the third guy, she described him as borracho and instantly said, but not drunk, just messy somehow. And he
Hmm.
seemed out of it. And he was in the blue shirt and the jeans and hair a little disheveled. And the three of them walked in, and about 20 minutes later, she thought she heard 6 backfires of a car. And then two of the three people come flying out and running down the stairs, jumping over her basically. And the girl is yelling, "We shot him, we shot him." And Serrano says, "Who did you shoot?" And she said, "Senator Kennedy." And the way she said it, Sandy clarified, was like, "Yay, we did it, like good going." And then they
Mm.
just ran out and disappeared into the darkness. And Sandy didn't know if that was true. She didn't know what was going on. She wandered around and she ended up talking to one of the assistant DAs and telling her story. And a journalist, Sandra Van Oker, happened to be standing nearby, said, "Come, I want to get you on the air and you can tell your story." And the assistant DA is like, "Do you think that's a good idea? Because we haven't controlled the story yet, right? We don't know what the story is. Do we want all the witnesses talking?" But by then she's already on the air. So, anybody who was awake at 2 a.m. heard Sandy Serrano live tell this amazing story. And again, the way she described the third person definitely matched everything Sirhan was wearing. And she didn't learn till later when she saw him on TV. She's like, "Yeah, that's the guy." And so the
Do we have
police.
that recording? Is there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In fact, you can probably find it online. And I think it's also in the Second Gun, and the full transcript is online. But yeah, seeing her tell it is pretty exciting. So, because
Mm.
you can tell she's being very honest. She's not making this up. And of course, the police didn't want there to be any co-conspirators, because in any shooting or, big crime or whatever, if you get one person and you can nail them, that's great. And it's like, we can call it a day. And so you can say, on one hand, it's just sheer laziness that the police want to like nail one person and let any other suspects go, because there's not a worse story than like, "Oh, we had an assassination and we couldn't catch all of them and they're still out there somewhere." It's much easier and safer public relations, to just say, "Hey, we got the guy," and that was it. And that's what the police basically chose. And in fact, that's literally on police radio right afterwards, because there were 6 different suspects described in the first half hour, I mean, the first hour of police radio traffic. And there are audio tapes of this, and one guy transcribed it and put it in his book, and I read them all. I'm like, that's like guy number 6. One of them was Michael Wayne, one of them was Sirhan, one of them was another guy caught at the hotel. But then there were 3 other guys who didn't match any of their descriptions. And
So who are these people? I'm curious. So who are the witnesses that are fingering all of these folks? And also, then what do the police do to justify not either following up with the accused or, vetting them as not responsible?
I wish I could read you the exact statement, but basically, after one of these things gets on the air, literally, like the chief of police comes on and he's like, "Hey," or is the chief inspector, and he's like, "Hey, we have only one suspect here, and he's already in custody, and we don't want to get them." They said, "We got Rayford Johnson, and he says he was the guy, and we don't want to get them started on big conspiracy." So, word from the top right away again, "We got one of them. Let's pretend there are no others." And that's why I actually called my book "A Lie Too Big to Fail," because once you tell that lie, you have to tell a
Mm.
whole ton of lies to cover up to make that lie credible. You have to just lie everybody else away. Oh, she thought the girl said "we shot him," but in fact, the girl probably heard him say "they shot him." That's what they did to Sandy. And they literally took her out for dinner. She was only 20, and she insisted on bringing her aunt along because she was afraid and didn't want to go out with the police alone. And they took her out like at 8 p.m. It was 10 p.m. before they got out of the restaurant. The cop ordered her wine. This was Hank Hernandez, who had just coincidentally formerly worked for the CIA, along
Mm.
with Manny Pena, who was running the conspiracy angle. Those two were thick as thieves, and all the conspiracy evidence went through one man, Manny Pena. There's literally a flow chart, and he is the choke point. So that's how you cover it up. You only need that one guy in that one spot. And he was not only CIA, he'd retired from the LAPD. They'd thrown him a ceremony, and his brother had been on TV saying how proud Manny was of his service to the CIA over the years. you know, while he was a
So here's
cop,
someone
he would go
who
away. So
was
anyway,
who
yeah.
had been in the CIA. He had been a cop. He had
Mhm.
retired, and the implication seems to be you're saying that they brought him back out of retirement, a well-documented retirement, in order to basically manage this
To
case.
do the cover up. Exactly. Which
Okay.
means somebody higher than him also was probably dealing with the CIA, which is pretty much the case. In every big city, the CIA has made contacts. In fact, in Dallas, the mayor of the city was the brother of one of the guys that Kennedy had fired, one of the top level guys, General Cabell. He'd fired him after the Bay of Pigs,
Mm,
along with Alan Dulles and the rest. And now his brother is
mm,
mayor of Dallas and in charge of the police department. And so that's they go to the friendlies, they make sure these happen in friendly cities. So, which begs the question who maybe was in this little town in Pennsylvania, which we'll come back to
mm.
that in a moment. But
But so you were telling me about how they wined and dined basically this
yeah, oh yeah. So they
underage
wined and
witness.
dined her, and Hank Hernandez even got her wine, even though she was underage, because at that point the legal age limit. But he's like, "Don't worry, you're with me." And then again, 10 p.m. She's had wine and she's underage, and she's been with her aunt. He brings her back to the station, says, "Now I want to give you a lie detector test," and she's like, "That was not part of the deal." And he convinces the aunt that, "Oh, you don't need to come in the room with us." And Sandy's like, "I want her in the room with me." And he's like, "No, no, it's gonna be fine." And the aunt's like, "Hey, we just had a free meal, we got wine. Seems like a nice guy. I'm not worried." And Sandy knows better. It's like, don't trust the police, but too late. So anyway, for the next hour and a half, Hernandez runs what could only be called a psychological warfare session on Sandy. It's as if he has a script and he works his way through this whole thing trying to make her feel guilty. If you love the Kennedys, you will not bring this conspiracy angle into it. You will not cause them any more pain. They've already had enough trauma in their life. Why are you saying this? And I know there have been other girls who thought they saw a second shooter or somebody else and they were wrong. And some of them admitted that they lied, and that's okay. It happens. And he's trying to give her like every possible excuse to change her story, and she doesn't. So what does he
Mm,
do? He goes and runs the whole session again, like all the same questions, same kind of pattern. And now she's starting to freak out because she's like, "Oh my God, is this going to keep happening until I say what they want me to say?" And she kind of calls him on it. And, of course, he won't break script for her, but in the end, you know, it is very sadly. It's like her voice trails off and her voice is like breaking, and and she basically said, maybe I misheard. Maybe she said they shot him. And maybe. And they used that as Sandy has retracted her story and she never saw that, and it's all been made up. And then on all the files, Pena now writes polka dot dress girl story phony, ignore on all the other like 20 some witnesses who also saw the girl in the polka dot dress with Saran at
oh,
various spots
interesting.
through the hotel that night. So that he used her to discredit all these other witnesses. It's very deliberate. It's not easy to do. They know what they're doing. And this is why I find it so disturbing. And by the way, about the bullet switch, I just want to mention this because um, I had a friend who was volunteering in the public defender's office, a coworker. And when I mentioned that to him, he's like, "Oh yeah, that's in the handbook." And I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" He goes, "Oh yeah, because police do that all the time." And I'm like, "So this wasn't even just for the Sirhan case. They just literally will make things up to frame the one person they have. The truth is not their goal." And that's
Yeah.
all I need to say about the trial is the truth was not the goal. The goal was to convict Sirhan and to shut up all evidence of conspiracy and bring forward witnesses just to shoot them down or put a different spin on their story. So if it got out, and you probably heard one of my interviews where I mentioned that as I read the trial transcript and I read the whole thing, pages were missing and in very strategic
Mm-hmm.
spots. And so I went through kind of the rest of what I had, but it was still bothering me. And I'm like, want to know what was on those pages. So I wrote the state archives, and she goes, "Wow, they're missing from my copy too, all those pages." She's like, "But let me check around." And she found a copy with the California Supreme Court, which had the entire unaltered trial transcript, but that's the one that ended up on microfilm, was the one with the pages removed. Somebody had to do that deliberately, and on those pages, on every one of them, was some reference to hypnosis. Somebody was trying to
Mm.
hide that from the future record, so if other researchers dug into it later, they'd be like, what's all this stuff about hypnosis? It's not even there. Well, it was there, it was taken out.
So
Yeah.
I do want to pivot to hypnosis now, and I want you to give us sort of the explanation for kind of the basis of prior use of hypnosis by the CIA, why this should be considered to be like a real possibility, how like what scientific basis or evidence it is that this kind of thing works. But just really quickly, I did have a question about Sandy. Um, I, so I presume that you know what happened during her interrogation because there is either a transcript of it or a
There's
recording of
transcript
it.
and tapes. There's both. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
That's just I wanted to be able to say that so that people understand that this is based on, actual research that you've done. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't take, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
go
you
ahead.
please. You don't take
Oh, I
what?
was just gonna say, if somebody just comes to me with a story, I almost my default position is not to believe it. It's like if I can find a document that's contemporary or a tape that's contemporary, that's way up on the evidence scale. Somebody calling me with their theory that, oh, the Zodiac shooter killed the girl in the polka dot dress and I can prove it. I've had enough of those calls, and they're huge time wasters. And at some point, I just stop listening and don't take them anymore because they never have anything behind them. So just because somebody tells you a story doesn't mean it's true. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was just what do you make of who this polka dot lady and the gold shirt man were? Because if there's a world where, let's say, they are part of the team that programmed Sirhan and they are CIA agents, what does it mean? What does it mean about the kind of like professionalism of the organization to have them kind of fleeing, joyfully proclaiming what they did? Do you think that her saying we shot him was a different kind of misdirection? Do you think that they were also kind of people outside the agency, but who were recruited for this purpose for different other kinds of reasons? I mean,
Yeah, so you have like CIA officer, and then you have like the agents they run under that, and then those agents run people further away. Those are like cutouts, like a Robert Mayhew character. And then Mayhew hires people with no connection to the CIA at all. And the further down that chain, and then that guy hires a couple of people and so on. And that's where the unprofessionalism seeks it. Yeah, a top, guy work at the CIA wouldn't make those mistakes, but those aren't the people you hire for these plots because they might get killed. You want people who are expendable. And so often they're not that reliable. And that's why some of these plots don't turn out the way they want them to. The JFK assassination plot, they tried a couple times to get him before they got him in Dallas. There was a Chicago plot, and there seems to have been a Miami plot, and also a DC plot, actually. So it's not like it all works perfectly the first time either. And even in the RFK case, there's hints that there might have been a plot in Oregon, the state before California. Somebody thought they'd run into Sirhan and that he had a gun in his pocket up there. It's not impossible that that was or a lookalike at that point. Um, so there's that aspect of it. Now, the other thing is the girl yelling. I found out that there was a guy who very much seemed to be part of the plot at that back door. Because again, you're at the back fire escape. It's not the area where guests are coming in or going out. No one should be coming in or going out. In fact, doors should probably have been closed, for fire safety or whatever. But there was a guy out with a walkie-talkie right there that two NBC producer wives noticed. And they'd kind of been watching him all night because they're like, everybody else was in a good mood and he seemed very intense and very focused. And I often wondered if Sandy didn't hear the shots because she couldn't have heard them from the pantry. It's too far away and they did sound tests. There's no way she could have
I
heard
was going to
shots.
ask about the sound testing because I had read that they said she
Yeah.
must have been lying
Yeah.
because there's no
And
way she would have
she
heard it from
never,
that far
right.
away.
They use that exactly. And the thing is, she never even claimed they were shots. She really thought they were car backfires. But it's very possible she was hearing it through the guy's radio because if his associate was in the pantry with the radio, then she could have actually
Mm.
heard some of the shots coming through the radio. And I think when the girl ran out saying, we shot him, it was to her compatriot at the door who was guarding that exit for them to make sure they got away. And they couldn't have known that Sandy was going to still be there. She'd been there 20 minutes before, but I'm sure they thought everybody had gone into the hotel by then. And at that point, they were also home free. What was she going to do? She wasn't going to be able to stop them herself. So
Sure.
they were
And
just,
after all of this, like, so
Mhm.
Sandy, she tells her story. She's sort of, interrogated into a retraction. And then she lived a life. So what did she say later about what she believed happened that night? How long did she live? Is she still alive?
Yeah,
What has she said since?
she's dead now, and there was a period where she didn't want to talk about the case at all. But when researchers caught up with her, from time to time, she always confirmed exactly the story that she had originally told. She never really backed off of it. So, but again, no credible reporter, went and interviewed her to say, no New York Times or LA Times reporter put her officially on the record. And so it's just those researchers, which in the LAPD's files they call them the cranks. I'm like, oh, those cranks are going to keep cranking. They literally discuss how they're going to hide the evidence from the cranks after the trial. And, they're even talking about dumbing up the bullets so that people can't see the real evidence. That's literally in the transcript in the judge's chambers. It's so shocking to me. At one point in the trial, they even admit to Sirhan's lead defense attorney, we can't prove the bullets came from the people that we're going to say they came from. And Grant Cooper, Sirhan's lead attorney, is like, that's okay, I'll stipulate to whatever you say. His lead attorney was himself under threat of indictment because he had been working on a trial with an associate of Johnny Roselli, who with Mayhew had run the Castro assassination plots that never quite came off. And Roselli was caught in a card cheating scandal. And so there were like four of them, and each of them had their own lawyer. So, his associate Morris Friedman had Grant Cooper as his lawyer. And he had a stolen grand jury transcript on his table in front of the judge, which is totally illegal. I mean, the whole point of a grand jury is utter secrecy, so people feel free to talk without fear of exposure. And so they held his punishment over him until the entire Sirhan trial had ended. Now, his punishment could have been complete disbarment, it could have been jail time, could have been, very serious fine. But what does he get at the end when Sirhan is convicted and sent to the death chamber? He gets a $1,000 fine. It's like the lightest possible sentence. Now, if you're going to give somebody the lightest possible sentence, why are you holding it over his head for the whole trial? Unless the point is, if you get Sirhan convicted, and as you read through the trial transcript, no prosecutor did a better job of convicting Sirhan than his lead attorney, Grant Cooper, which
Jeez
is
Louise,
so
I'm sorry.
sad.
I'm
It's
still
so
hung up
sad.
on this idea that was an admission during trial from the prosecutors that the bullets that they had
In judge's chambers, so not in front of the jury, but yes, in the judge's chambers, which are still in the court transcript. Yeah, I put that exchange in my book because it's so shocking that they literally admit that, because you're supposed to put the bullets through the chain of possession, and the cop who signed the bullet, because everybody has to mark the bullet, and then the next person who gets it, either marks it or logs it into evidence or whatever. And when they log it into evidence, they write the things down. So they were basically saying we've already kind of ruined the chain of possession on the bullets. So just can you let it slide? And he's like, yeah, sure. I'm like, how is that not grounds for a retrial right there? Just that one piece of item. I don't
and
understand.
subsequent appeals have said what exactly? Because obviously Sirhan's still in jail. You said that this,
Yeah.
um,
As
yeah,
time goes by, it's like supposedly the standard of evidence goes up, and they're like, well, if that's true, why didn't this lawyer back in 1980 say that?
yeah, that's what they do. It
And the
becomes a
problem is,
cyclical, yeah.
yeah, and the problem is, of course, no one really looked until Lynn Mangan looked, and then I looked and I wrote about it. And that's,
Yeah, really shortly,
you know,
only a few years after the trial transcripts became available in the first place. I am curious. You said you've spoken to RFK Jr. about this. That you've met him.
yeah, I got him to go see Sirhan, in fact, because he was working on his book American Values, and we met because David Talbot was trying to talk him out of something that Bobby had gone down one of these rabbit holes in the JFK assassination that David and I both knew wasn't true. And David's like, at least I can't shake him from this. I don't know what to
Hmm.
tell him. Who knows that? And I'm like, I actually know that. We wrote about that in Probe, and I can
Do you
talk him
remember
out
what
of
it
it.
was that he thought was
Yeah,
the
it was this
alternative
guy.
theory?
There's a James Files who claims that he killed Kennedy in Dealey Plaza from the grassy knoll, and that he bit the shell and left it there. And a shell was found in that spot years later, and some people use that as proof. Wow, he really killed him. But the shell wasn't even made until 1972. So once I was
Hmm.
able to get Bobby to look at that, because I'm like, Bobby, I know that's not true. He's like, but his story's consistent and this and that. I'm like, ugh. So anyway, but I was able to show him proof. Look, that shell, look at the marking on the base. Look at, here's the article and here's the picture. So that's how I talked about it. But then at the end of that conversation, I said, by the way, your uncle never tried to kill Castro. And that was like our moment of bonding because he's like,
Mm.
I know. I went and I talked to Castro and he knew my father hadn't been involved in the plot. And I knew that because in my JFK research, I had read the IG report on the Castro plots. Because in 1967, this is during the Jim Garrison investigation, of course, the story came out that the CIA had been trying to kill Castro, and that maybe that plot had caused Castro then to kill Kennedy, was kind of the spin of the. So it was like a way to deflect from the CIA as Jim Garrison was closing in. That's why the story, I think,
Mm.
got leaked in the first place. But the CIA was kind of freaked out that the story was out at all because they weren't supposed to be in the business of killing anybody. And at that time, it hadn't really made the public. And so Johnson then commissioned this, he asked the IG to look into it, write a report, and tell me what's going on. And the CIA did its own internal damage report through the IG first. Like, what can we say? What can't we say? What do we know? What don't we know? And at the very end, they asked themselves, can we claim we had any layer of executive authority for this, and answer their own question? In this case, no. They said, we did tell Kennedy about the plots that had ended, but we didn't tell him about any of the plots we were still doing. And that's right there in the CIA's own files. And so when I gave that to Bobby, then he's like, oh my God, I'm putting that in my book. And then he would just call me out of the blue, Lisa, who was this guy who did that? Or, what was that? And so for a while we were good buddies. And then when, the Gaza war started, I'm like, Bobby, you have to say
Yeah.
something. Here, I like, this is a gift to you because you have the ability to distinguish yourself in a way that no other candidate can. You have the credibility to do so. You will win the election if you support the Palestinians in this case. And he came back at me with like, have you read Alan Dershowitz's book? And I'm like, that
Oh
Jill?
boy.
And I mean, seriously, the stuff that he was quoting back to me was so bad. And at one point, he's like, maybe it's better if they're all gone, meaning, maybe it's just better if they just wipe out all the Palestinians. And that was the
No,
moment.
he
It's like,
said that?
he said that to me personally. And after that, I didn't ever want to talk to him again. That was the end of it. That was the end of
Wow.
it. And it's like, oh my
Yeah.
God. And everybody I know, Jody Evans, had a code pink and, tried to talk to him. Um, yeah, pretty much any wonderful person of substance on this planet reached out to Bobby. It's like you're on the wrong side on this one.
Yeah, I mean, Dennis Kucinich was his campaign manager, and then he wasn't his campaign manager. I've interviewed him a couple of times. Crystal Ball. I mean, we've all had these exchanges with him.
His campaign manager now is his daughter-in-law, who used to work for
CIA.
the CIA, whose first two
Yeah.
marriages were fake marriages, which makes me wonder about her current marriage.
Wait, what do you mean there were fake marriages?
Meaning they were cover marriages. She was on her mission, and it was a way of keeping her CIA cover to marry these people for, strategic advantage or whatever. And I can't help
That's
but
fascinating. Wait,
wonder
how do we know that?
because she talked about it openly in an interview.
Huh.
Now,
Huh.
maybe she really loves Bobby, the fourth, I guess it would be, or the third. Um, I'm sure she loves her kids. But I also know I read somewhere, and it might have been Whitney Webb, but somebody said that they tried to plant Ghislaine Maxwell on Robert Kennedy Jr. because he was the one most likely to run for president someday with all his environmental advocacy. And he was the only one, God bless him, to challenge the 2000 for election results because we all know 2000 was stolen. I watched it unfold right there on TV. But 2000, yeah, the Gore election we knew was stolen, but
Hmm.
2004 was less clear. But there was really good evidence that the Republicans hacked in to Ohio and got the votes changed. And Bobby wrote about it in Rolling Stone. So he was definitely on the radar of the people who would like to keep things the way they are and not expose that kind of stuff. Um,
So then tell me, help me understand this then. Because help me understand this because what does what does RFK Jr. think of your research and analysis of what happened to his father? And if your analysis points in these ways to CIA involvement. How does he respond to that as someone who has been critical of the CIA and the FBI, but who also does have a campaign that's now being run by someone who was formerly in the CIA?
Formerly. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't believe anybody really leaves the CIA, to be honest. Um, he thinks that there are good people in the CIA and bad people in the CIA, and he thinks he can decide which is which. And I think too that there are good people in the CIA and bad people in the CIA, but I don't pretend to be able to know which is which.
Mm,
You know, it's like because
mm,
they're very good liars. You can't get a job at the CIA unless you are an absolutely world-class liar. That is like job requirement number one. So I would never trust somebody in the CIA because of that. And I have had CI people come and talk to me, and one guy, he was hilarious and entertaining, but I would just look at him, I go, lie, lie, lie. 'Cause it's like I don't believe a thing
mm.
you're saying, but you're fun, you're interesting, but don't pretend I am gonna believe you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so to really drill down into this deeper, because I think this is what then reconnects it back to some of the speculation that's happening around Donald Trump, which is the question of, why was Bobby killed? Why does Bobby Jr. believe that Bobby Sr. was killed? And as someone who has also studied the history of all of these other assassinations, MLK, Malcolm X, JFK, et cetera, all in quick succession, I mean, the implication, obvious or subtle across the board, seems to be that these are the most popular, left leaning, critical of the US establishment, military industrial complex, status quo figures in the country who have the potential to be revolutionary leaders and to really bring on a populist sea change, and who need to be cut off at the knees. The question then becomes, is that a reasonable conclusion that some people, especially obviously supporters of Trump, are raising about why there were these security lapses last week? That's kind of where I'm getting to. But let's start with just the Bobby Kennedy example.
Well, just
Why do
with
you think?
Bobby, exactly. Well, first of all, like I said, you really can't talk about the Bobby Kennedy assassination without the JFK assassination. Oswald was a CIA project going back to the 50s, and they were moving him around the world, and setting him up for various plots. I actually think they were preparing him to be a patsy in a Castro plot, and then turned around and used him as a patsy in the JFK plot. I don't think Oswald was ever the wiser until that day, when it all came down.
Hmm,
And he's like, oh my God, I'm just a patsy. Um,
hmm,
the CIA, both brothers, and it's funny, I almost wrote a book on both of their assassinations, and I was going to call it Collision Course, because the way I see it is there are two competing worldviews. And this is the problem we've had, my entire life, your entire life, probably the entire history of human race. There are those who want to make the world better for everyone, and there are those who want to make the world better for themselves. And
hmm,
it's this eternal struggle. And Ellen Dulles represents that selfish faction. We're going to rip off all these third world countries. We're going to give them aid and then pull it back and make sure they owe us for life. And Kennedy's like, no, we're not going to give them arms so they become military dictatorships. We're going to give them economic aid, and we're going to give them schools and food programs and show them how to farm. And we're going to help them become truly independent. So these are absolutely competing worldviews. One doesn't make money for the elites, and the other very much makes money for the elites,
hmm,
right? And I really sadly, bottom line, I think it comes down to that. It's about those who want to steal versus those who don't want others to be stolen from. And JFK and RFK were very much in that mold. And I believe for that reason they were taken out. And Bobby, especially because, again, he would have reopened. Everybody knew if he got in, he would reopen. In fact, there was a question in the California primary. People would always ask him, do you believe the Warren Commission? You always say, oh, yeah, I believe it. But he didn't. And he told his close friends, it's like, that's a piece of crap. It was clear that that's the cover story. And he actually sent teams of friends looking into different angles. He had one team looking into like right wingers like H.L. Hunt and stuff, and another team, could it have been Castro? And another team, what about the mob? And another team, what about the Russians? And of course, what about the CIA? His first instinct, Bobby's first call after learning that his brother had been killed, was to call the CIA duty officer and said, did you guys kill my brother? And at that point, CI director John McCone, who's a friend of the Kennedys, comes flying over, running into his house, basically, no, no, the CI wouldn't do
But
that.
that's what's so confusing. You got a friend, you got a CIA friend. I mean, this is I think the interesting paradox about RFK Jr. as well. There is this kind of outsider posture. Yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I was gonna say he kind of explained that, and I don't remember if it was in his book or in a talk or to me, because they all kind of run together sometimes. But
Mm,
he said his father especially believed that some of the CIA's work was good. Like, for example, the CIA funding Obama's father so he could come over to the United States. That was like CIA money that helped make that
wait,
happen. He
how
thought that
did
was a
I
good
not
thing.
know that? Wait, how do we know that the CIA
Well,
got Obama's father
well,
over
I
to the
mean,
United States to
obviously, no
study?
one knew who Obama was at the, and no
I mean,
one
he
knew
didn't
he was going
exist.
to be. Yeah, yeah, he
Sure.
hadn't been born yet, so it's like let's not go that far with it. But you know what I mean. But it's like the CIA does do some things that help people around the world, and at least in Bobby's opinion, I've looked hard. I've not seen the evidence to support that, but this is what Bobby believes, and I'm sure he gets that from his CIA daughter-in-law. To be perfectly
Mm,
honest. I don't know what she's told him about what she's done, and I'd like to think there are good people out there. I met a guy who had left the CIA because he was so upset with everything he'd been asked to do that he basically went into hiding for like 10 years. And then he tried to commit suicide. And then when he started reading
mm,
our little probe magazine, he reached out to us because he's like, you guys give me hope because you're exposing all this evil stuff that the world needs
mm.
to know. And he wanted to help us in any way he could. Um, but most of them aren't like that. And yeah, and so Bobby said also growing up, the CI was in and out of his house. The anti-Castro Cubans were coming in and going. His mother loved them. His mother was a real like rabid right winger before she married RFK Jr. Her whole family is like would be Trump supporters. That
Mm.
side of the family, the Skakels. And so it's kind of odd that RFK would have married into that, except that I'm sure he appreciated the energy and the rebel quality as they got older that he might not have appreciated so much. But she was also
Mm.
Catholic and she loved him and they had so many children together. It probably would have worked it out. Like to think that. But um but yeah, they and also in the East Coast, it's like Bobby was in naval intelligence when he was in the Navy. He was part of the elite. He's a rich guy. He was an intelligence officer, and I
Mm.
don't think JFK was, but um, they were just surrounded by it. Almost all their friends, Harvard and Yale, all those guys end up going into intelligence, and so you don't have a bad opinion when they're your friends and your football buddies, right? And that's also the problem with the media because the CIA literally befriends the media and invites them to their parties and hosts, gatherings and come to our, place in Key West and, whatever. It's like, it's hard to be mean to somebody who's being so nice to you, right?
Yeah, it's frustrating that people kind of are able to be persuaded by that sort of thing, but it's completely true
Yes.
that that's the case. And that's what's so I think mystifying about RFK Jr. as a figure, because he does play this kind of insider outsider role rhetorically, saying I'm willing to go against these institutions and I'm willing to take on certain shibboleths and I'm willing to occupy kind of ideological space that is very toxic to the mainstream and all of these things. But he is fundamentally a Kennedy. There is no more powerful or recognizable political family than that. He's from a family where, you know, we're talking about his mother being besties with CIA members coming in and out of the house, and his daughter-in-law, who's quote unquote formerly CIA, is running his campaign. And it does feel like the country as a whole, people who love him, people who hate him, are kind of wrestling with these contradictions in who he is and his own belief that the
And he believes the
main
CIA killed his
narrative.
father and his uncle. He's
Right.
very clear about that. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
how do you sit with that while still not having a very clear line of antipathy against the CIA? And I think for me, especially combined with his frustrating is not a strong enough of word, disappointing, horrifying views on Palestine, I agree with you that there was a real lane for him. I think a lot of us on
Mhm.
the left were kind of, RFK curious, or like open supporters of him when he first announced his campaign, because he did seem like someone who, for better or for worse, even if he didn't, you know, toe the Bernie Medicare for all line or here or there, whatever, maybe you don't love his vaccine beliefs or COVID, whatever, I don't care.
Yeah.
He was going to be able to unite the country in a way that could do some damage to the duopoly. But then what confidence do you have in someone to genuinely go after the real power centers in the country when it seems that you will bend the knee on the red line that has always been Israel and the United States' relationship? Which again, like
Exactly.
now brings us
Yeah, you
to
can't
this
claim to
Trump
be
stuff.
independent if you are not independent of Israel. And you can't claim to be anti-war and be okay with the genocide of, at this point, hundreds of thousands, I believe, Palestinians.
Yeah. At least this new Lancet study, of course, that predicts it could be upward of 186,000. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so I know that there were a lot of people. We rattled off tweets, we speculated, jokes were made, all kinds of things were said after the Trump assassination attempt. And I do think that, it was almost impossible not to compare it to other assassination attempts. To look at, people were comparing the kind of speed, the alacrity with which the Secret Service jumped on Reagan after he
Mhm.
was shot and whisked him away to the car. The oddness of Trump having an opportunity to stand up and pump his fist and to not have coverage, right? If a camera can shoot you, a gun could ostensibly shoot you. To have that exposure in that moment that yielded that now iconic photograph, is that in and of itself proof of another security lapse? Why the shooter was in the scope of the Secret Service for all that time without being taken out. We're now comparing this, black, I think he was reportedly now schizophrenic man with knives that was shot outside of the Republican convention as police rushed him from a safe distance away and shot him because they say, like they always do, that they fear for their safety. That man with knives who was miles away from the convention and posed no threat, taken out immediately. And yet we see the
But a
contrast
white
between
guy,
what the
yeah.
ultimate shooter. Yeah, so like people are asking questions, both I think in some good faith and some bad faith, as to what might have happened. And so I know this is all very speculative, but I do wonder what
And
your
I'm happy to speculate, but I will try and distinguish facts from speculation. So, fact
yeah.
is, we know Trump's position when he was shot. He was turned almost entirely to one side. And my problem with the current scenario is that the shooter was just a little to the front of him, which to me means the bullet would have to kind of like curve around his nose to hit his ear unless I've got the angle wrong or whatever. But I've looked and I've looked and I've looked, and I'm not convinced I have the angle wrong. There
And do you
were,
think, like, because the wind, I've been seeing people say things about how the windy conditions, the flag was obviously waving above his head. I saw some reporting that said, well, it's not good security protocol to even have a wind indicator like a flag above a target, a potential target, because it
oh
allows the
wow, I didn't
shooter
even think
to,
about that. Yeah, to see where the
use
wind is
that to help
blowing.
to exactly.
Yeah. Well, here's the other thing. The thing that really bothers me, it's Thomas Crooks, I guess is his name. So let me talk about Thomas Brooks for a minute, because to me, the huge red flag in that scenario, why didn't he bring his ID? Because if he was planning to escape, and a friend of mine who had a sniper for a father said, snipers always, the first thing you plan is your exit route. That's the first thing you plan. The second thing you plan is how you're going to kill the target. But the first thing you plan is how to save your own life and get away. So he didn't have an exit route, it seems.
So the idea being like there are people who will just run up to you and shoot you, like say the guy who shot Abe in Japan, or maybe the guy who shot Reagan, and that those are people who are willing to die for it.
Well, yeah, you named two people that I still think could be mind control victims. So I think it's so
Okay.
much more prevalent than we understand. But that he had no ID, because if he had a motive, if he had any motive at all, you would think he would want people to know who he was in case he died and why he did it. Most people who kill, like, the Lincoln assassination, six imperatorius, that's always the tyrants. I mean, he made a statement. He
Mm,
wanted people to know he had shot him and why. And,
mm.
ridiculous because uh, anyway, so it bothers me greatly. And in my book, I quote the chief of detectives at the LAPD at the time, who was upset because Sirhan had no idea on him. And he said, usually, In a crime like this, when the person has no ID on them, it's to give co-conspirators time to get away. And that's coming from the chief of detectives of the LAPD. That's a pretty strong statement.
So help me understand that. The idea is if it takes longer to identify the like kind of captured perp,
Right.
then they are not going to look up whatever their roommates or their associates.
Right. And somebody in his life may have been helping him. And the longer they went without knowing him, the more chance that person has to get away out of the country, out of the media, out of, sight forever. And and so that bothers me. And like I said, the angle bothers me because I'm not convinced that the shot that nicked his ear could have come from that sniper's shot. There were two other locations. One, well, three if you want to. There's like big tall trees. There could have been a sniper in the tree for all we knew. But there was a water tower, excuse me, and there are videos of witnesses online. And again, I can't vouch for their credibility. They seem very normal and like they were shot contemporaneously that day. But people have been forwarding them to me, knowing my interest in these things, and saying you got to watch this. They say there was a shooter at the water tower. And there is a water tower that's in a better trajectory to hit Trump's ear, given the way he had turned at the last second. And if he hadn't turned, it would have hit him like right in the head there. So, and it's a close enough trajectory to the building that they could have blamed Thomas Crooks for it without it actually being Thomas Crooks. So, because of my work on the Sirhan case, I'm not willing to condemn Thomas Crooks before all time as the shooter. I think it's way too soon to know for sure that he was the shooter. I'd like to see, did the bullets match? Where did the bullet go that hit Trump's ear? It must have landed in the stand somewhere. Did they collect it? Did they match it back to Thomas Crook's gun? I would like to know that.
Or to
These are the
the
questions I would ask.
deceased,
Yes.
the attendee that died, or the other, yeah.
Did he have a bullet
Yeah.
in? Does that match Thomas Crook's gun? And here's something I just learned is that he was literally, the building he was sitting on was filled with state police underneath him. They were using it as a staging center.
Well, reportedly, one even came up the ladder, right? Saw
There's
him and
video
chose to
of
go
that.
back down.
Yeah,
Oh, is
there's
there video of that now? I
there's
missed that.
there's
Okay.
literally video of the cop poke his head up and then the guy sticks his gun at him and he drops to the ground. But I'm thinking if there's a window from there, cracked open, that too is, if they're way in the corner of that building, that's a slightly better angle for getting Trump's ear without hitting his nose first on the way around. Um, so I want people to look into this case. I want them to investigate. I think it's only a time for asking questions. I don't think it's a time for making
Yeah.
definite statements. I don't know if there were two shooters. I was talking to my boss at work. He's like, well, what do you think the probability was? And I said 30%. And I'm sure he thought that was really high, but I think I would love it to be 0%. I would love to know for a fact that it was this young man, whether we ever learn his motive or not. It would be great if all the evidence really does point in that way. And then I thought, but if it were the CIA is just, every assassination in the 60s kind of had a dual purpose. So blaming Oswald for Kennedy, and Oswald didn't shoot JFK any more than Sirhan shot, that's a whole nother story. But they had set Oswald up as a pro-Castro supporter and a pro-Soviet guy who had almost defected to the Soviet Union. So they were trying to like blame Castro and the Soviet Union and discredit the Fair Play for Cuba committee all in one swoop. So, layered on action, not just kill Kennedy, but let's get a propaganda play out of it. And the same with Sirhan. Not only are we going to set up this young Palestinian, but we're going to use it to generate more support for Israel. Because look, this wild Palestinian in our midst, look how terrible he was and what he did.
What was the coverage like at the time? Do you have a sense of how often the fact that he was Palestinian was used to characterize the event in the same way that you mentioned that what was the LA Times reporter was talking about what were we talking about, the Kennedy assassination?
The Oklahoma City bombing.
Oh, sorry, it was Oklahoma City. Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there was no mention of the CIA ever in the coverage of the RFK case, except for one slip from Police Chief Redden on video that I happened to see over at UCLA in the film archives. And one of the journalists asked him right away, do you think there's any CIA involvement? And he goes, the CIA. It's like, it was hard for him to say it. He like choked on it 3 times. has nothing to do with this, or something like that. And then that was it. But it was so weird because he had been perfectly smooth as silk with all the other questions. And that one, it was like, why are you asking me about
Hmm.
the CIA?
Hmm.
But the Palestinian thing, it didn't come up in like the first 48 hours because no one really knew what had happened. And this motive, like I said, was pretty much greatly enhanced by his team, because they say if you tell the jury you can't remember, no one's going to believe you. They're just going to think you're lying. You have to have a motive. What was your motive, Sirhan? Wasn't it because of this thing in your pocket? And that's when they put him under hypnosis and think of the bombers, Sirhan. Think of the bombers. And Sirhan's like, he can't, meaning he can't send the bombers. And so it was part of the story. At that point, there wasn't a lot about the Palestinian conflict. That was fairly early in that there had been the 1967 war, the year before. So I thought it was interesting that this took place exactly on the anniversary of that, literally June 5th. So Howard Hunt wrote somewhere that the CIA chooses dates with great deliberation for maximum psychological value. And I thought of 9/11, it's like, emergency, right? What
Hmm.
better? So
Hmm.
anyway,
So
that's all
I do feel
speculation.
like, okay, so I do feel like I have to confess to you, I almost have been dodging the hypnosis aspect of this, partly because I gotta acknowledge my own skepticism that I fully also acknowledge could be due to a lack of understanding on my part about how
How the world
real
works. Yeah.
this is, and like also like how much this is something that we've seen applied by the CIA as an agency, like in practice, and also because I think it is easy to look at the evidence and say that there's some kind of cover up going on here without necessarily thinking, one, it doesn't necessarily mean that Sirhan was not a shooter, that there weren't, that he was not a part of it. He could be a part of it and there still be some kind of cover up and the CIA could be involved because of the forensic discrepancies. Um, or two, that he wasn't a part of it, but there was, drugs or alcohol or something else at play that made him.
Which they've tried to suggest. They've
Who's
tried to
they?
suggest Sirhan's legal team tried to suggest that he
Mm-hmm.
had four Tom Collins that night and that he was just drunk. But the police at the initial hearing is like he shows no signs of alcohol. And you've seen drunk people. We've all seen somebody drunk. We
Sure.
know the signs: the bloodshot eyes, the smelly breath, the slightly bleary look. Not one person reported that about Sirhan. So you can say he had four drinks, but he didn't normally drink. And so I don't actually believe that. I think, and somebody might have told them that he did. There's a really weird interaction he has with the bartender at the hotel. And you have to read my book for the whole thing. It's from Dan Brown's Hypnosis Sessions with Sirhan. And he's like, it was like we had met before and there was an unspoken language between us. And I'm thinking the bartender is this hypnotist. It seemed real
Mm-hmm.
to me. Like he and the polka dot symbols were like a hypnotic trigger. When you program somebody to do something, you usually give them two signals, not one. And the first like brings them into a state of readiness. And then the second thing is what they act on. And I believe the polka dot symbol was to bring them into a state of readiness. And she wasn't the only one in a polka dot outfit there. There was a guy in a polka dot tie they met just before they went into the pantry. The girl at the door as they went into pantry had a polka dot scarf and later claimed she was the girl in the polka dot dress, but she wasn't. And then she ended up dead a year, after doing that. And she was very young. And there were other people in polka dot dress. And yet I looked through the 2000 or so photos the LAPD still has of the event. There's no one in polka dots in any of those photos. And I thought, what a good way to clean up the team is, find the polka dot dress photos and throw them away, because the funny thing is they kept like 2000 photos that have no evidentiary value whatsoever. They burned like 20,000 photographs in a hospital incinerator so there could be no chance that any part of them
Wait a
could be
minute.
seen.
How do we know about them being burned in the hospital incinerator? Is that something else that they told the judge?
It
Huh.
was reported in the LA Times. that
Huh.
they had, they burned the evidence because the trial was over and they didn't see any reason to keep it around. And they claimed those photos had no evidentiary value. I'm like, they had no evidentiary value. Why not just throw them in the garbage can? Why do you actually have to go burn them unless maybe they did have evidentiary value? I mean, the
Also,
level
how
of
can you
cover up
know
is
that?
so shocking. Yeah, yeah.
And the details that you can realize are important in a photograph after the fact. A
Exactly.
future potential president had just gotten
Mhm.
shot. That's a huge,
Yeah.
huge case to have such confidence in getting rid of evidence, even under the best and like most good faith reading of it.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
talked openly about the fact that there might be a congressional investigation, which is why they destroyed the evidence. It's like they want so, but let me talk about the hypnosis because I spent like a couple of years I tried to go to as many shows as I could because I really wanted to understand, does it work, does it not? I don't think I've ever been hypnotized myself, but on the other hand, to some level, almost all of us act. I read that our brains, we're on automatic pilot 80% of the time. Like only 20% of the time are we actually thinking and choosing. The rest we're just kind of coasting, which is scary enough as it is. But in these shows, I remember like one of the first ones I saw, the hypnotist said, early on to the audience, he's like, by the way, after the show, don't talk to them, just give them their space. He's like, if you do talk to them, you'll see why. And so, of course, I'm like, I want to talk to somebody after the show. What am I not supposed to see? And so after that particular show, I remember some guy had been hypnotized to propose to the girl he was with, something he'd refused to do for 5 years. Suddenly he's proposing to her. And I felt so bad for the girl because how embarrassing, for her story to be made
Yeah.
public and stuff. But afterwards, his friends came up to him. It's like, wow, you proposed to her. He's like, no, I didn't. And they're like, yeah, we just saw you. He's like, I wasn't hypnotized. And we're all like, oh, yeah, you were. His friends could tell that's not the way you normally act. And he was just in complete denial and didn't believe he'd been hypnotized at all. So that was like the first incident that kind of clued me in. But the second one was even more personal because one of the shows, I ended up sitting next to somebody who was invited up on the stage and hypnotized. So I could see a before and after. And so, before normal as can be, we had a nice little chat and, how many shows like this have you seen and blah, blah, blah. And then she goes on stage and she's told she won a $35,000 check. And, oh, I won. And, just as you would expect in any show. And, maybe she's acting, maybe not, or whatever. And then at the end of the show, of course, they're all unhypnotized, supposedly, and sent on their merry way. And I ran off to talk to the hypnotist. And I asked him about, Sirhan, because I'm like, you always say people can't be made to do something they don't want to do. And but what about the Sirhan? And he's like, got visibly uncomfortable. And it was a young guy. There's no way he could have been involved. But it's like the topic must be something they discuss among themselves, visibly uncomfortable to the point that he packed up early and left the area. And I thought, well, that's weird. Meanwhile, as the crowd's clearing, I see the woman I had just been sitting next to. I'm like, oh, good. I'm going to go talk to her and ask her about it. And she's looking distressed. And I thought, well, maybe she lost her family or something. And I walk up to her and I'm like, are you okay? And she goes, well, I have to give this back. And she's holding it's play money. And I'm like, well, it's just, it's like Monopoly money. I don't think he cares. And she goes, no, it's a $35,000 check. I have to give it back. And I'm like, are you sure? I said, can I touch that with you? Can we look at that together? And she let me touch it. And I'm like, can we pull it a little closer? And she's like, yeah. I'm like, can you see this number in a circle up here in the right? And she goes, it's a $35,000 check. So some part of her consciousness knew I was pointing at the 100 in the circle, but the other part of her that was hypnotized had to rebut that. And I could not break her out of this. And this was after she had supposedly had the hypnosis turned off. And I can't tell you how many stories there are in the literature about people who were poorly hypnotized and not unhypnotized.
So I want to talk to you with the literature because I am not someone who is closed-minded to this type of thing. I am not someone who is gonna like poo-poo astrology or like the suggestibility, the mysteries of the human brain, psychoanalysis. I mean, I'm very open to this sort of thing, but I think while
But it's
I
not
can
it's not a psychic thing. It is like a physical thing. And and here's the funny thing, because most hypnotists will tell you we don't know exactly how it works. We only know that it works. And they said it's not somnambulism as we thought at one point. It's not putting people in like a pre-sleep state. We know it's not that, but they can't say exactly what the mechanism is. They can say that some people can't be hypnotized at all. Some people can be made to do just about anything you could imagine. But the one thing they say, and I understand why they say it, is that you can never be programmed to do something that would be against your moral code, but they can get around it. And here's an example. If I somehow managed to hypnotize you and I told you to go kill your mother, I don't know what your relationship with your mother is. Let's assume it's a good one. All right.
It's a
But if
good
I told
one.
you, okay, if I said go kill your mother, you wouldn't do it, no matter how hypnotized you were. But if I managed to get you in a very deep state of hypnosis and I said, your mother is in trouble, a Soviet agent has replaced her. She has been taught to cry like your mother. She looks like your mother. She had plastic surgery. She's been taught your entire history. She will know everything about you, but it is not your mother. And the only way you can recover your mother is by killing her, and then your mother will be freed. If you were of that most highly hypnotizable site, and if I were a skilled hypnotist, which I'm absolutely not, but under that scenario, now I've put it in a frame that works with your moral code, right? So now you would have no objection to taking out an imposter to free your own mother. And so that's how they get people to do things against their will. They come at it from an angle. And, with Sirhan, like I said, I don't even think he killed anybody. They just needed to get him to fire as if he was at the target range again. It's just the simplest thing. It wouldn't take hardly any programming to get somebody to do that. Just pull out a gun and fire on command, and we don't have to worry where you're firing because it's not really firing bullets anyway.
So I guess my question though is not like the idea that hypnosis can work, which again, I'm open to, but that it has been used in this kind of an application by the CIA. So, and you've mentioned this guy, Dan Brown, a couple of times. So I wonder if you can kind of root this and what we know about the practical application of this to help kind of root it in, yeah, in reality and in some in plausibility. Yeah.
Right. When Nixon fired Helms, which is basically what he did when Richard Helms was running the CIA, when Watergate happened, Nixon wanted the CIA to take the fall for it. Helms refused. Nixon fired Helms. McCord had written and said, if Helms goes, every tree in the forest will fall. And of course it did. And Helms, on the way out, Helms asked for all the mind control files to be burned, all of them. The only reason we even know about any of these projects is from some accounting files because no one thought to look at the accounting department. And they have the payments to the various schools and hypnosis and hospitals and research facilities and, prisons where these tests were going on. And so there's actually a huge body of evidence, but it doesn't go into the details of the operations, but it hints at them. And there are a few files that are extant. And in my book, I quote from the CIA's own website. You can literally go there and search for hypnosis and read some of this for yourself. And in one of them, they're like, all these academics who say you can't make people do something against her. Well, they're such amateurs. Any good hypnosis person, worth his salt can make people do just about anything. And one of them proposed a scenario and then a few months later said basically that they had success with it. They got the files that we know about have test situations where like one girl was made to pick up a gun and shoot her friend while she slept. And she did, and she fired the gun, but of course they'd taken the bullets out of the gun. And then the argument was, well, of course she fired because she assumed you had taken the bullets out of the gun. So she had no problem firing it. And then I go, but what if I hadn't taken the bullets out of the gun, right? Then she would have
Yeah,
fired
we were
anyway,
raised to
thinking
never
I
point.
had, right?
Yeah, we
So,
were raised not to point toy guns at each other. My mother was very upset with our grandparents when they got my brother a super soaker, and we also weren't even allowed to go like pew 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 like this at each other. My mother would throw a fit. So
oh, good for your mother.
I hear that story, and I'm like, because back in the '90s, there were all these stories. I mean, still to this day, that there were all these realistic looking guns, and kids were shooting each other by accident with real guns. And so she was like, to this date, I won't like pick up a plastic water gun and point it at someone like that. But all that being said, I think that it's very reasonable that a normal person would have some degree of hesitation before picking up a real gun with metal and weight to it and just trusting that it didn't have live rounds in it. So that is compelling.
And there's two TV shows, by the way, and I think they're both online. One was done by the by Darren Brown, who is a mentalist who does hypnosis, and he did a whole show, a whole episode. This is a UK program, and he mimicked it after the RFK assassination. And he found a guy who was an incredibly hypnotizable subject. He used a polka dot trigger, and then he got him to fire at an actual person, fire a actual gun. And he was told when he was given the gun, he's like, by the way, be very careful with that gun. It's got real bullets in it, and just we need you to take this to somebody after the show. And so that's why he had the gun. And then when the girl touched him and gave him the magic words, basically, he stood up and he fired at the comedian who had been wired with squibs and fell down as if dead. And of course, the whole audience is shocked. The kid who had done the shooting was kind of a blank. And even when they showed the video back to him later, he was kind of a blank. He's like, I can't believe I did that. It's like, and so Discovery Channel tried to discredit that and tried to do their own version, but their guy ended up shooting too at the end. So it's
Lisa, I
very
gotta say, while you were talking, I went to CIA.com or whatever .gov,
uh,
and I typed in the search bar hypnosis, and a number of articles did in fact come up. I'm looking at one dated September 22nd, 1993, called Hypnosis and Interrogation. It opens, the control over a person's behavior ostensibly achieved in hypnosis obviously nominates it for use in the difficult process of interrogation. It is therefore surprising that nobody, as the induction of mesmeric trance has moved from the halls of magic into clinics and laboratories, seems to have used it in this way. And then goes on to talk about potential application in the field of interrogation. Now, I'm sure you would say, this 1993 report, obviously people are using it for various purposes, and the CIA knows better because,
you have
but
to go
this is
back to the
specifically about,
50s. I was going to say, if
yeah.
you look at the documents from the 50s and 60s, they were more open about it because at that point, they had no notion of the internet, searchability. There was no
Mm.
expectation those files would ever be made public. And so they were much more open about the success of some of their, Helms and one of his guys are talking cagely about the operational aspects of it. And, somebody was complaining, should we use this on unwitting Americans? And Helms is like, we have to. If we don't use it on unwitting Americans, we'll never know if it works. It's like, because they're okay using it on foreign nationals because they're all racist, right? But, do we dare use it on our own people? And, and Helms is like, yes, we got to use it on everybody. And for a while, they tried prisoners because, who cares about prisoners, right? They're in
Yeah.
jail. They must be bad people. We can do whatever we want to them. It's so sad. Vacaville, by the way, is one of the places where the CIA did some of the MK Ultra experiments. Manson spent time there, and
So for MK
Sirhan's
Ultra,
team, yeah.
could you just explain for those like me who are just hearing about some of this for the first time what MK Ultra is?
Okay, and I'm going to go back a few years. So in the 40s, before the Korean War, which was supposedly the start of our mind control programs, but back in the 40s, there was this thing called Project Bluebird, and it was Army, Air Force, Navy, and CIA as it was being created, doing mind control. Can we protect people against interrogation? Can we use it as a form of lie detection? Can we get people to do things that they wouldn't want to do? And that then morphed into, I forget all the in between projects, but one of the biggest ones that we know about simply because the most files were found on it was MK Ultra, which was this huge umbrella project that had literally hundreds of sub projects within it, each sub project testing a very specific thing. Can somebody under hypnosis be? Oh, Project Artichoke's the one that came between those. So early 50s, Project Artichoke, which by the way, there's the term like give him the A treatment. It was the artichoke treatment, and it was
Huh.
drugs and hypnosis to see if they could, compel people to do things. And one of the documents, which kind of describes what later happened in the pantry, is like, can we get a person of redacted nationality to commit an act of attempted assassination as part of a larger plot? And that's kind of what they did. So they made it look like Sirhan was committing an act of assassination, but it was the real plot was for him to pull focus so they could get other people in to do the real assassination. And so evidently the answer to that was yes, because they kept doing it. But again, that was back in the 50s. In the 60s, they were having some success in talking again somewhat openly about it. And then, of course, in the 70s, the files were destroyed. And since then, there's been almost nothing about any of the mind control. And I have to think if they had success in the 50s, they're still doing it. There's no
I
way
mean, I'm
you would.
looking. I randomly clicked on another one of these articles at CAA.com. I'm sorry, look, this is crazy. It's called The Operational Potential of Subliminal Perception. It's from September 1995. And it's talking about some application that it says, in the most sensational of these popularized experiments, an increase in popcorn sales in New Jersey in a New Jersey movie theater is said to have been stimulated by subliminal interruptions of the feature film with an advertisement urging the patrons to buy popcorn. The exposure time used, a small fraction of a second, was too brief for conscious discrimination by an observer absorbed in the film story, but presumably long enough to have had some stimulating effect. And then again, going on to talk about
Then
the
people left the theater and went and bought popcorn. Yes.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean,
It's like I'm sure somewhere along the way, or maybe it's because I took a psychology class, but we learned about like the ego and the id, and the ego is like the
mhm.
conscious mind, the id is like the unconscious mind. And so to me, my best understanding is that hypnosis has a way to bypass the conscious mind and go right to the unconscious mind, which doesn't make choices. It just receives information and acts on it. And if you can get to that part of the mind, you can really control somebody. And again, not everybody is. They say, only about 20% of the population is super hypnotizable. I was going to make a joke there about politics, but I won't.
Well, I
But
heard you say on another podcast that it's people who are like very focused that are more hypnotizable, and then if you have ADHD, it's more difficult. And I was like, great, I I can be confident that I'm operating on my own free will because
oh,
boy, oh boy, am I a distractible queen.
exactly. No, I often check myself, and like I said, I watch the news super skeptically these days. When I see a
Hmm.
story, especially if I change the channel, they're all saying the same story. I say, I wonder if that's true. And then I start doing my own
Hmm.
research. I never just
Hmm.
assume it's true. And so when they all say this is the shooter, my default position is I wonder if that's true. And does the trajectory make sense? Why didn't he have ID? Where is his motive? And all these things. And I hope that I've inspired people to at least look a little deeper. And I think of my book, I used to be a trainer. I used to train people on software and stuff. When I wrote the book, I wanted it to be like a class on how to research conspiracies. It's like my subterranean, topic throughout to empower people to evaluate information and to ask the right questions. Because I think people don't know the questions to ask. Sometimes they suspect, but they really don't know what to do with that suspicion or where it can go. And sometimes they go off on crazy tangents. And, I know for this particular case, we may not know anything for 20 years. I mean, until we get to those files, and that's one of the things I argued at the end of my book is we need to pass laws to make those kind of files available much sooner, like 5 years after the fact, not 25 years after the fact, so that individuals in the neighborhood can go ask some of those people, what did you see? And follow up on some of those questions or ask the question the interviewer just skipped and didn't ask. Because sometimes you're reading an interview, it's like, follow up on that. He just said he saw somebody standing behind the wall. Why don't you ask him what he looked like? So in my book, I did that. There was a guy who was like 13 years old in the pantry, and he saw a guy step from behind a wall and shoot. Sirhan didn't step from behind a wall. So I'm like, who did he see? And, why did he phrase it the way he did? And why was he certain one of the shots was coming from a downward angle as if the shooter was in a high position? Because he was standing on the table. And anyway, so I hope I have helped crack some minds open, and I hope that people really do. I'm not a fan of Trump by any stretch of the imagination. I personally can't stand the guy, but I don't want him dead. I don't want anybody to take away our choice at the ballot box. I'm not even sure
Mm.
that counts, but if it does, I have to live in the hope that some level of that does still count, or they wouldn't all be trying so hard to get Biden to step down, right?
Yes, and I do think, my what part of my frustration is, for years I've been reporting on Trump, and been this effort to paint him as an outsider, even though during his term he did nothing of what he promised in terms of, rooting out the deep state and canceling the FBI and all, but
Need
even
to
outside
release
of
the
like the
JFK
kind of
files.
exactly, exactly. So there's a part of me that's like, well, why kill him? We've seen that he didn't actually
Yeah.
rankle the establishment in a meaningful way. But I will say the argument that is more persuasive for me is the one that says he hasn't only rhetorically spoken consistently about wanting to cut off aid to Ukraine, which the deep state of both parties, the national, quote unquote, national security interests across the board, political board, are very invested in. But the Trump allied members of Congress have also worked to try to in some ways thwart the agenda. I mean, obviously funding has continued to get passed, but there was this question of, does Trump really mean it this time? Like, if this war were going on while he's in office, would he veto any money that Congress tried to pass to go out the door to Ukraine? And is that a sufficient threat to actually want to go to these kinds of lengths to prevent him from becoming president? And obviously that's pure speculation, but to me, that's the only hook that makes sense in terms of why the powers that be would want to go that far.
Well, he had just been talking about NATO, how he wanted to, end our involvement in NATO. And to me, that was
exactly.
motive enough, but again, it may
And on the
not
other
have been
hand,
the
Biden won't
CIA.
shut up about NATO.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he's like, NATO. Can anyone else put together NATO? Who saved NATO? Like, my good guy, literally nobody cares. Like,
Right.
like nobody cares
It
about
doesn't
me.
put
Like,
food on my table. I really don't
yeah,
care. Yeah.
yeah,
But I do
yeah.
care. I mean, obviously, the Ukraine is an awkward, provoked situation that's hard to defend on any level. What happened?
Yeah, and I've heard you say, and I think you frame it really beautifully, like, what's happening to Ukrainians is horrible. This isn't like I'm an anti-Ukraine situation, but the question is whether or not we're all being inducted into a proxy war where the motive is not securing peace and security for the people of Ukraine, but quote unquote
Right.
weakening Putin. And so
Yeah.
that's where we are. And I didn't mean to
Yeah.
interrupt. I'm sorry. Go
And
ahead.
and I was also going to say, to me, whoever rolls tanks across the border first should lose, because that is an invasion of a sovereign nation that should not happen in this world where we have internet 365 days a year, 24/7 for the most part. It's like we can reach out and talk to each other anywhere in the world. There's literally no excuse for war anywhere at this point in time. It's so shocking to me, and it's equally shocking how many people are just okay with Israel wiping out Gaza. That is not okay with me. And I have always been pro-Israel in the sense that I've always defended their right to exist. And, I finally said, I'm not sure they have a right to exist, and I'm not sure we have a right to exist. I don't think any nation funding genocide has the right to exist.
I think that trajectory that you just described for yourself is being experienced by a lot of people. And I just really appreciate your openness and your warmth and your intellectual curiosity and the bravery and courage that it takes to ask uncomfortable questions and the tenacity and intelligence it takes to do the kind of research that you've done over all of these years, and the kind of the presence, your willingness to come and talk to me at such short notice. All of these things I'm just very, very grateful for. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you.
And so tell before we wrap, I do want you to give you an opportunity to tell the audience where they can find your book and more of your writing or your presence on the internet and beyond, so they can keep in touch and continue to follow your work.
Yes, I'm very active on the site formerly known as Twitter, now known as X.com, which I think is a sucky name. But
Agreed.
I'm at Lisa Pease, so you can always find me there, and that is literally the best place to interact with me. I don't friend people on Facebook that I don't know, so please don't try. It's just, if we haven't talked, you and I have talked, but most strangers approach me, I just don't friend them because I don't know who they are, and I've had bad experiences when I've taken chances. So, yeah, my book is still in some bookstores. It is available at Amazon. It's available at any independent bookstore. There's various, I don't know. You can literally go to your favorite bookstore and ask them to order it for you, and they will. So I appreciate that, and I do plan to do some writing in the future, and I'm just not quite sure. I have so many topics I could write about. I have to pick just one, and that's the hard part. So,
Well, look, I would love to hear more about some of these other assassinations. I do think that there is this thread that goes through many, if not all of them. And the the kind of temporal clustering of them at a certain moment in American history, when there really did seem to be this opportunity for change, I think is really instructive, especially right now when we similarly feel to be on some kind of shift, some kind of precipice. So I'm really grateful for your work. And thank you to all of you listeners for tuning in for this 2-hour episode. I know you love the long ones. My apologies in advance to producer Armand, who is getting this pretty late in the day on Wednesday before this episode is going to go up. So please be patient with us if it's a little bit delayed getting posted. It's because we had such a big and good one lined up for you. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.